The air inside the palace of Zeno did not ripple. It bled. It was a silence so absolute it felt like a weight pressing against the marrow of Goku's bones, a vacuum where even the echoes of his own heartbeat seemed like an act of rebellion. Before him sat the king of all, the being who could erase existence with a stray thought, but there was no majesty in the figure on the throne. Zeno sat as a hollow shell. His eyes, once wide with innocent wonder, now glazed over like cooling glass. From the base of his spine, thin, vibrant threads of predatory light climbed into the rafters of reality, disappearing into a dimension that Goku's eyes could not yet name. They were the chains of authority, and they hummed with the terrifying rhythm. Appreciated time. Goku took a step forward, his boots clicking against the polished floor with the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil. He wasn't here to fight a god. He was here to rescue a friend who had been turned into a ghost. As his hand reached out, the dragon seed in his chest pulsed with a frantic warning rhythm, but he did not pull back. The moment his calloused skin brushed against the shimmering lattice of the chains, the multiverse let out a collective agonizing shriek. Golden alarm sigils, miles wide, erupted across the white void of the palace, burning with a light that blinded the stars themselves. The system of heaven, a machine of absolute control, had recognized a foreign infection. Goku wasn't just a trespasser anymore, he was a glitch in the divine order. As Zeno's fingers twitched, a tiny, heartbreaking sign of life, a shadow fell over the throne. The Grand Priest materialized not with a bang, but with a terrifying, gentle grace. He looked down at Goku's hand, his smile as sharp and cold as a surgical blade. "How touching," the priest whispered, the sound vibrating through Goku's very soul. "You truly believe that the warmth of friendship can outweigh the cold geometry of authority." With a flick of the priest's wrist, the chains didn't just tighten. They began to rewrite the air, turning the oxygen into lead and the light into a cage. Before we witness the final fracture of the divine order, walk with us through the fire, so that the memory of the dragon is not erased from the stars. The silence of the palace of Zeno was not the peaceful rest of a world at sleep. It was the suffocating, sterile quiet of a tomb built from light. In this high white void, where the foundations of reality were supposedly anchored, there was no wind, no scent of life, and no sound of shifting key. There was only the throne and the small, slumped figure that occupied it. Goku stood at the threshold of the great hall, his breathing heavy and ragged, each exhale sounding like a sacrilege against the oppressive stillness. He had fought through the dragon void, he had tasted the bitterness of betrayal, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of the king of all, the being who had once jumped with joy at the sight of a simple button now reduced to a decorative fixture of the heavens. Zeno did not look up as Goku approached. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his small, colorful hands resting limply on his knees. To a mortal eye, he might have looked asleep, but Goku's senses, now sharpened by the nascent pulse of the dragon seed, saw the truth that lay beneath the skin of the world. From the base of Zeno's neck and the center of his spine, thin, vibrant filaments of iridescent light stretched upward. They were like the silk of a cosmic spider, translucent, yet pulsing with a rhythmic throb that matched the heartbeat of the palace itself. These were the chains of authority, the invisible leashes of angelic law that did not merely bind the body, but overrode the very will of the one they touched. Goku felt a coldness settle in his gut that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He remembered the Zeno who wanted to play, the Zeno who marveled at the tournament of power, and the Zeno who considered Goku a friend. That version of the king was gone, buried under layers of divine correction. As Goku stepped closer, the dragon seed in his chest began to burn, a low, growling heat that reacted to the presence of the chains. He could see them now, not just as light, but as a series of infinite microscopic commands. Be still, do not speak, rule through silence, yield to the priest. The architecture of the divine was built on these mandates, a complex geometry of control that turned the ultimate power into a mere battery for the Grand Priest design. The throne room felt as though it were expanding and contracting with every one of Goku's heartbeats. The gold and white marble of the floor seemed to shimmer with a predatory intelligence, waiting for the moment he would commit the final sin. Goku reached out a hand, his fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer pressure of the atmosphere. The air here was dense with permission. Every molecule of oxygen required the palace's consent to be inhaled, and as a branded rebel, Goku was being denied. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but his gaze remained locked on Zeno's dull, vacant eyes. "Zeno," Goku whispered, the name feeling heavy on his tongue. There was no response, not even a flicker of recognition. The filaments of light grew brighter, sensing the proximity of a foreign soul. They began to hum, a high, glass-shattering frequency that vibrated through Goku's teeth. It was the sound of the universe's ultimate law asserting itself. The Grand Priest had not just sealed Goku away, he had lobotomized the very concept of friendship from the throne room. To the system of heaven, Goku was no longer a person. He was a variable that needed to be deleted, a smudge of dirt on a pristine white canvas. The dragon seed pulsed again, harder this time, sending a wave of ancient primal warmth through Goku's arm. It was a prompt, a nudge from the lineage of the dragon god that existed before the first angel was ever breathed into being. It told him that the chains were not absolute. It told him that laws were just words, and words could be broken by the weight of a true will. Goku gritted his teeth, the golden glow of his aura beginning to leak through the cracks in his skin, not the jagged electric light of a Super Saiyan, but something deeper, more liquid, like molten bronze. He took the final step, his hand hovering inches from the central strand of light that anchored Zeno to the rafters of reality. He knew that to touch the chain was to declare war on the very fabric of the cosmos. Goku's fingers finally closed around the central strand of light. It did not feel like steel, nor did it feel like energy. It felt like a cold, absolute fact. To hold the chain of authority was to feel the weight of every decree ever uttered by the divine, the weight of gravity, the inevitability of death, the rigid geometry of the stars. For a heartbeat, the world went white. The dragon seed in Goku's chest roared, a primal sound that echoed not in the room, but in the deeper, older dimensions of his spirit. The seed recognized the chain as an abomination, a gag placed upon the mouth of the universe. Then heaven screamed. The sound was not a voice, but a harmonic fracture. Across the infinite white expanse of the palace, golden sigils the size of continents flared into existence. They rotated with the precision of clockwork, casting long, jagged shadows across the marble floor. These were the immune cells of the celestial order, ancient defensive protocols that had not been triggered since the dawn of the first era. They hummed with a violent, purifying frequency, identifying the Saiyan not as a warrior, but as a cancer to be excised. Goku didn't let go. His hand began to smoke as the angelic law tried to erase the limb that dared touch it. "Zeno," He growled through gritted teeth, his voice cracking under the pressure of the localized reality shift. "I know, you're in there." For a fraction of a second, the chains slackened. The dull, gray film over Zeno's eyes shattered like thin ice, revealing a glimpse of the terrified child beneath. Zeno's small fingers twitched against his robes, and a single crystalline tear began to form in the corner of one eye. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated humanity in the heart of a cold machine. In that look, Goku saw everything: the loneliness of the throne, the horror of the silence, and the desperate plea for a friend to end the nightmare. But the system was faster than the soul. As if sensing the king's momentary rebellion, the chains surged with a fresh, cruel radiance. They didn't just tighten, they began to vibrate at a frequency designed to liquefy the spirit. Goku's dragon armor, still in its primal, unformed state, shimmered into existence around his arm, scale-like patterns of bronze light clashing against the white gold of the angelic filaments. The friction between the two powers created sparks that tore small holes in the fabric of the room, showing glimpses of the dark, chaotic voids that lay outside of ordered space. "Stop," a voice commanded. It was not a loud shout, but it carried the weight of a falling mountain. The Grand Priest did not walk toward the throne. He simply occupied the space behind it as if he had always been there, a shadow cast by the light of the chains. His expression remained one of terrifying, serene composure, but his eyes, usually a calm, icy blue, were now burning with a pale, judgmental fire. He looked at Goku's hand, still clutching the divine restraint, and his smile didn't falter. It only grew more pitying. "You have always been an interesting anomaly, son Goku," the priest said, his voice weaving through the air like a silk thread. "A mortal who reached for the hem of divinity. But there is a difference between a guest and a master. By touching those chains, you have moved beyond the status of a hero. You have become a target of the law." The Grand Priest raised a single finger. The golden sigils in the air accelerated, their light turning from a warm amber to a harsh, blinding violet. The trial of heaven had begun, and it was a trial where the verdict had been written before the first breath of the world was ever drawn. The Grand Priest's raised finger did not fire a beam of energy, it fired a decree. At his silent command, the violet sigils rotating in the air began to contract, shrinking until they were the size of coins, then accelerating until they became a blur of lethal geometry. They didn't strike Goku's body like physical blows, they struck his definition. Each impact felt like a piece of his history being peeled away. The memory of his first training under Master Roshi, the heat of the Namekian sun, the roar of the crowd at the World Martial Arts Tournament. The angelic law was attempting to simplify him, to reduce the complex, defiant soul of Son Goku into a singular, manageable data point, an error to be corrected. Goku's knees buckled, the marble floor beneath him cracking into 1,000 spider webs. The dragon seed in his chest pulsed a dark, violent crimson, fighting to anchor his soul to the present. He felt the dragon's blood within him screaming against the erasure. "I'm not a data point," Goku hissed, his voice sounding like two grinding stones. He looked up, his eyes flickering between their natural dark hue and a piercing predatory gold. "I'm the one who's taking him home." The Grand Priest's smile didn't waver, but a flicker of something, perhaps a distant clinical curiosity, passed through his gaze. "Home? You speak of a concept that does not exist for the King of all. His home is the throne. His purpose is the balance. Your friendship is a parasite that feeds on his divinity, making him weak, making him emotional. I have merely performed a necessary surgery." He took a step forward, the light of the chains casting long, flickering shadows that looked like grasping hands. "Look at him, Goku. He is perfect now. He is silent. He is absolute." Goku looked. Zeno was staring straight ahead, the single tear that had begun to form now frozen on his cheek like a diamond. The chains were no longer just glowing. They were beginning to fuse with Zeno's skin, weaving into his very essence. The sight sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated rage through Goku. A rage that felt different from the burning fire of a Super Saiyan. It was older, it was colder. It was the roar of a dragon seeing its hoard, its most precious bond, desecrated by a thief. The air in the throne room began to liquefy. The dragon seed wasn't just pulsing anymore, it was blooming. Small bronze scales began to shimmer beneath the skin of Goku's knuckles and along his jawline. The pressure he exerted back against the palace's permission became so great that the golden sigils in the air began to shatter upon contact with his aura. He wasn't just standing in the room, he was reclaiming the space. The only thing perfect about him, Goku said, his voice dropping into a register that made the entire palace tremble, was that he could still smile. You took that away. Goku's grip on the chain tightened, and for the first time, a sound of structural failure echoed through the hall. It wasn't the sound of metal breaking. It was the sound of a law being defied. The Grand Priest's eyes narrowed, his calm finally beginning to fray at the edges. The violet light of the sigils turned a harsh, angry red. "Enough," the priest whispered. "If you will not kneel to the law, you will be crushed by it." The floor beneath Goku's feet vanished, replaced by a swirling vortex of white gold script, the literal text of the universe's foundation. The palace was no longer a building. It had become an execution chamber, and the Grand Priest was the headsman. The white gold script flowing beneath Goku's feet was not mere decoration. It was the source code of the multiverse. Each character represented a fundamental law: the speed of light, the pull of gravity, the necessity of cause and effect. As the Grand Priest accelerated the execution protocol, the script began to rise from the floor like glowing embers, wrapping around Goku's ankles and climbing his legs. Where the letters touched him, his physical form flickered, turning translucent. He was being unwritten. The Grand Priest watched, with the detached interest of a scholar observing a failing experiment. "To exist is to be defined by the law," the priest lectured, his voice echoing from every direction at once. "You seek to exist outside of it. Therefore, the law must simply state that you were never here." Goku's breath hitched. He could feel his memories being tugged at, as if the very air was trying to suck the Saiyan out of his soul. But deep within the center of his being, the dragon seed didn't just resist, it laughed. It was a sound like tectonic plates grinding together, a vibration that predated the Grand Priest's laws by an eternity. The dragon did not ask for permission to exist. The dragon was the foundation upon which the first breath was drawn. "I don't care about your rules," Goku gasped, his eyes now fully burning with a molten bronze light. He didn't pull away from the chains, he pulled on them. He used his own erasure as leverage, anchoring himself to the one thing in the room that was more absolute than the priest's words: his bond with Zeno. As he yanked the chain of authority, a shockwave of raw, unrefined dragon ki exploded outward. It wasn't a blast of energy, it was a pulse of presence. It hit the rising script and shattered the letters into meaningless sparks of light. For the first time, the Grand Priest's perfect composure didn't just crack, it shattered. He recoiled a single step, his eyes wide as he witnessed the impossible. Goku was rewriting the execution chamber simply by standing his ground. The bronze scales on Goku's arms began to solidify, forming the first true plates of the dragon scale armor. They didn't reflect the light of the palace, they seemed to swallow it, creating a silhouette of ancient predatory power. "You are not just immortal," the priest whispered, his voice finally losing its melodic calm and turning into something sharp and dangerous. "You are a heresy." Outside the palace, the very sky of the divine realm turned a bruised, angry purple. The alarm sigils that had been rotating in the hall now began to scream in a physical, auditory way, a siren that could be heard across every universe. In every corner of existence, the angels felt a cold shiver. The system had reached its final conclusion. The Grand Priest raised both hands, and the chains of authority connected to Zeno's spine began to glow with a blinding, lethal heat. If you love him so much, Son Goku, then you shall share in his shackles. If I cannot erase you, I will bury you in the law until the end of time. The air became so heavy that the marble floor beneath Goku disintegrated into dust. He was no longer just fighting for a friend. He was fighting to keep the universe from becoming a graveyard of puppets. He looked at Zeno one last time, at the frozen tear, at the pleading eyes, and his heart solidified into a diamond of pure dragon-forged resolve. "I'm coming for you, Zeno," Goku promised, his voice a low roar that drowned out the sirens of heaven. "And I'm bringing the fire with me." At that moment, the entire palace of Zeno pulsed with a violent white light. The trial was over. The hunt had begun. Son Goku was no longer a contestant, a hero, or a god. He was a target. The moment Goku's palm fully pressed against the chains of authority, the universe did not just react. It recoiled. It was as if a jagged, rusted nail had been driven into a flawless sheet of silk. To the angels, this was the sacrilege, the ultimate violation of the hierarchy that kept the multiverse from dissolving into the chaotic soup of its birth. For billions of years, the palace of Zeno had been a place of perfect calculated mathematics. Now, Goku's touch had introduced a variable that was fundamentally uncomputable, a heart that valued a friend more than the law. The sensation hitting Goku was a tsunami of data. It wasn't energy he was feeling, but the cold, crushing weight of every no ever spoken by a creator. No, the stars cannot burn forever. No, a mortal cannot outlive his breath. No, a puppet cannot choose his strings. This divine resistance poured through Goku's arm like liquid nitrogen, seeking the center of his spirit to freeze it in place. His skin didn't just burn, it began to turn into the same sterile white marble that made up the palace floors. The law was attempting to statuefy him, to turn the rebel into a silent monument of failure. Deep within his chest, nestled in the space where his mortal key usually flickered, the dragon seed felt the intrusion. It didn't react with the explosive golden heat of a Super Saiyan. Instead, it pulsed with a deep, subterranean thrum. It was the sound of the first dragon's heartbeat, a rhythm that was ancient when the Grand Priest was a mere thought. The seed did not fight the frost of the law, it consumed it. "Is this all the law is?" Goku's voice was a ragged whisper, but it carried a terrifying clarity. "Just a bunch of reasons why people can't be happy?" The dragon seed flared, and a sudden, violent surge of bronze energy shot through his veins. The marble creeping up his arm shattered into dust, and the scales beneath his skin solidified with a metallic chime. The sound was a harmonic dissonance that caused the golden sigils in the sky to flicker and stall. It was the first time in the history of the palace that a mortal's presence had caused the divine clockwork to skip a beat. The Grand Priest, standing behind the throne, watched the bronze light lick at Goku's knuckles with a look of growing clinical alarm. He had seen gods rise and fall. He had seen universes erased with a yawn. But he had never seen a being whose soul was actually rewriting the definition of the ground he stood on. The priest's hands, usually folded perfectly behind his back, twitched. "You do not understand the weight of your crime, Son Goku," the priest said, his voice now vibrating with a metallic edge. "You are not just touching a chain. You are touching the nervous system of creation. If the king wakes up before the law is ready, the reality you know will unravel like a frayed thread. You are the architect of a catastrophe." Goku didn't look at the priest, he looked at Zeno's hands. Under the pressure of Goku's touch, the tiny fingers were no longer limp. They were gripping the armrests of the throne. The sacrilege was working. The puppet was beginning to feel the heat of the fire. The Grand Priest did not strike with a fist. He struck with a definition. He raised his hand, and the violet sigils that had been lazily orbiting the throne room suddenly snapped into a rigid horizontal grid, the lattice of erasure. It was a shimmering floor of pure logic that rose from the marble, passing through the physical matter of the palace as if it were nothing. To the lattice, Goku was not a man of flesh and blood. He was an unauthorized equation. As the grid passed through his legs, Goku felt a sensation more terrifying than pain. It was a cold, hollow emptiness, as if the concept of movement and standing was being deleted from his mind. "You speak of friendship as if it were a shield," the Grand Priest remarked, his form blurring and reappearing inches from Goku's face. The transition was so instantaneous it bypassed the concept of speed. But friendship is a biological impulse. It is a chemical flickering in the brain of a mortal. It has no jurisdiction here. The priest's palm pressed against Goku's chest, right over the glowing dragon seed. The impact sent a shock wave through the room that didn't break the walls, but rather changed their color, turning the pristine white into a sickly, bruised indigo. Goku's breath hitched as a surge of angelic law poured into his heart, attempting to overwrite the dragon's heartbeat with the rhythm of the palace. "Be still, son Goku," the priest whispered, a chillingly kind smile on his face. "Let the law simplify you." But the dragon seed did not know how to be still. Deep within the core of Goku's being, the ancient voice of the dragon, the voice older than angels, gave a low, guttural growl. The bronze scales on Goku's arm suddenly flared, growing jagged and sharp. They didn't just resist the priest's touch. They bit back. A sudden burst of primal ki, raw and unrefined, exploded from the point of contact. It was the scent of old earth, of burning stars, and of the first storm of creation. The Grand Priest's eyes widened as his palm was forced back. For the first time, a small, glowing scratch appeared on the porcelain skin of his hand. It was a microscopic wound, but in the context of heaven it was an impossibility. An angel had been harmed by a mortal's intent. You are not just using power," the priest muttered, his voice losing its melodic perfection for a sharp, jagged tone. "You are using authority. Where did you find a law that counters our own?" Goku didn't answer with words. He answered with the scream of his soul. He wrenched the chain of authority again, and this time Zeno's eyes didn't just flicker. They snapped open. For a brief second, the dullness was gone, replaced by a searing sapphire light. Zeno's mouth opened, and a sound that wasn't a word but a raw, cosmic sob escaped his throat. The lattice of erasure shattered into a million violet shards. The alarm sigils in the sky turned blood red. The sacrilege was no longer a localized event. It had become a systemic failure. Goku's dragon-scale armor began to spread up his neck and across his shoulders, shielding him from the crushing atmosphere of the palace. He looked the Grand Priest in the eye, his own gaze now as sharp as a dragon's talon. "The dragon doesn't ask for jurisdiction," Goku growled, the bronze light of his aura beginning to swirl like a hurricane, "and the dragon is the jurisdiction." The Grand Priest looked down at the glowing scratch on his palm, the tiny fissure of red light appearing like a crack in a perfect porcelain doll. For a moment, time itself seemed to stumble. The angels were the stewards of existence, the calm center around which the chaos of the multiverse was organized. To be wounded by a mortal, especially one using a power that did not belong to the hierarchy of the heavens, was more than a physical injury. It was a theological catastrophe. The priest's face, usually a mask of serene detachment, finally shed its warmth. His features sharpened into a cold, geometric precision. "You have introduced blood into the hall of the bloodless," the priest said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates. "You have proven that your existence is no longer just an error, Son Goku. It is an infection." With a slow, deliberate motion, the Grand Priest closed his fist. The red alarm sigils in the sky didn't just scream, they began to rain down, They descended like burning flakes of ash, each one etched with the target command. As they touched the floor, the marble didn't shatter, it transformed. The ground beneath Goku's feet turned into a liquid gold that fought to swallow his boots, acting like a sentient quicksand designed to anchor his reality to a single unmoving point. High above, the vaulted ceiling of the palace dissolved, revealing not the starry sky of the cosmos, but a series of infinite concentric circles of light. This was the eye of the law, the automated gaze of the multiverse's central nervous system. It turned its blinding white focus directly onto Goku, and the pressure increased 1,000-fold. It felt as if every atom in his body was being interrogated, judged, and found wanting. "The dragon seed you carry is a relic of a failed era," the Grand Priest continued, his body beginning to glow with a terrifying translucent radiance. "A time of chaos, of instinct, of unrefined will. The angels were created to bring order to that mess. We are the correction, and a correction does not negotiate with the mistake." Goku's dragon-scale armor was now a shimmering bronze carapace covering his chest, shoulders, and arms. It groaned under the weight of the eye's gaze, the metal-like plates glowing white-hot. But Goku didn't flinch. He leaned into the pressure, his muscles bulging with a strength that wasn't just physical. It was the strength of a promise. He could feel Zeno's small, trembling hand near his own, and that sensation was more real than the crushing weight of the heavens. "You talk too much about what things are supposed to be," Goku growled, his breath coming in hot, steaming bursts. "But look at him. He's not a balance. He's not an equation. He's just a kid who's scared." Goku's aura, now a violent, swirling vortex of bronze and deep crimson, flared outward. It didn't just push back the gold liquid at his feet. It burned it away. He stepped forward, the sound of his armored feet on the marble echoing like the tolling of a funeral bell for the old world. With a roar that shook the foundations of the palace, he reached out and grabbed a second strand of the chains of authority. The reaction was instantaneous. A brand appeared on the back of Goku's hand, a glowing, jagged sigil that mirrored the alarm lights in the sky. He was no longer just a trespasser. He was Target No. 1, the first and final enemy of heaven. From the corridors of the palace, the sound of rhythmic, metallic footsteps began to approach. The angel guards, the elite executioners of the Grand Priest, were responding to the brand. They were coming not to arrest him, but to erase the very memory of his name from the stars. The corridors of the palace, once corridors of infinite peace, now exhaled a cold, rhythmic thunder. From the blinding white mists of the periphery, the angel guards emerged. They did not walk. They glided with a synchronized mechanical grace that made the heart stutter. Each was a towering silhouette of silver and pale blue, their faces obscured by masks of smooth, featureless crystal. In their hands, they carried lances of condensed law, weapons that didn't cut flesh, but severed the connection between a soul and its timeline. They formed a semicircle around the throne, their presence causing the very air to crystallize into jagged frost. They didn't shout or issue demands. They spoke in a terrifying polyphonic unison that vibrated through the marrow of Goku's teeth. "Target identified," the chorus sang, the sound devoid of all heat. "Son Goku, status anomaly, sentence total redaction." Goku stood his ground, the bronze plates of his dragon-scale armor grinding together as he tightened his posture. The brand on the back of his hand, the jagged mark of Target 01, pulsed with a searing white light. It wasn't just a mark of shame, it was a beacon. He could feel the eye of the law tracking his every cell, calculating the exact moment to strike. But beneath the panic of the palace, Goku felt a strange, terrifying calm. The dragon seed was no longer just a source of power, it was becoming his conscience. It whispered that these guards weren't living beings, they were the walls of the cage. And to free the bird, one had to break the walls. "You're not going to touch him," Goku said, his voice dropping into a low, predatory growl. He didn't look at the guards, he looked at the Grand Priest, who remained perched behind Zeno like a vulture made of light. "And you're not going to touch my world." The first guard stepped forward, its lance flickering with the violet energy of erasure. With a movement too fast for mortal eyes to track, it thrust the weapon toward Goku's heart. In any other form, Goku might have dodged or blocked with a Kai shield, but the dragon scale armor didn't react like a shield. As the tip of the lance touched the bronze scales, the armor rippled. It didn't just stop the attack, it bit into the law. A shockwave of bronze sparks erupted, and the angelic lance, a weapon designed to delete universes, shattered like cheap glass. The faceless mask of the guard tilted, a flicker of something resembling confusion passing through its static form. It had never encountered a substance that refused to be defined by its edge. "My turn," Goku whispered. He didn't use a Kamehameha. He didn't use a strike he had learned from a master. He simply exhaled, and with that breath, the dragon seed sent a wave of raw, unrefined authority through his limbs. He swung his fist, and the air itself seemed to scream in protest. The blow didn't just hit the guard, it unraveled it. The silver armor of the executioner dissolved into a cloud of meaningless data, the soul within returning to the great white void from which it was forged. The Grand Priest's eyes narrowed, the scratch on his palm glowing with a renewed, angry heat. "You are breaking the tools of creation, Goku. Every guard you destroy is a hole in the order of things. Do you truly wish to rule over a ruin?" "If the order means Zeno has to cry in silence," Goku replied, stepping over the shimmering dust of the fallen guard, "then let it ruin." As the remaining 99 guards leveled their lances, the brand on Goku's hand suddenly flared with a new, terrifying frequency. It began to show him visions, not of the fight, but of Earth. He saw the peaceful fields of Mount Paozu, he saw Chi-Chi hanging laundry, and he saw Gohan looking up at a sky that was beginning to turn a sickly golden hue. The brand wasn't just tracking him, it was linking his execution to the lives of those he loved. The sacrilege of contact was complete. Goku was no longer just fighting for the king, he was fighting against a heaven that had decided that if it could not own the dragon, it would burn the dragon's nest to the ground. The Grand Priest did not move to strike. He simply watched, his hands once again clasped behind his back, as the shimmering dust of his elite guards drifted through the air like the remains of a burnt prayer. There was no anger in his expression, only a deep, weary disappointment, the kind an artist feels when looking at a canvas ruined by a stray splatter of ink. To him, the dragon-scale armor was not a glorious evolution, it was a crude, prehistoric armor, a relic of a time before the universe had been polished into its current orderly symmetry. "Do you hear it, Son Goku?" the priest asked, his voice carrying a haunting melodic resonance that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "The sound of the stars screaming? Every time you exert that primal filth, you are not just fighting me, you are grinding the gears of the multiverse to a halt. You think you are a liberator, but you are merely a grain of sand in a watch, proud of the damage you cause while the time itself begins to fail." He began to pace, his feet not touching the floor but treading upon the very air, which crystallized into tiny, glowing geometric patterns beneath his stride. "I built this silence. I designed the peace that you have enjoyed for so long. The king of all is not a friend, Goku. He is a function. He is the eraser at the end of the pencil. Without the chains of authority to guide his hand, he is nothing but a storm without a center. You wish to free a hurricane? You wish to give a child the power to blink away entire civilizations because he had a bad dream?" The priest stopped, leaning in close, his pale face reflecting in the polished bronze of Goku's chest plates. His smile was thin, a mere line of cold light. Your friendship is the most selfish act in the history of creation. You would trade the safety of trillions for the smile of one boy. Tell me, Saiyan, is that justice? Or is that just your blood craving the chaos of a world without rules? Goku's breathing was heavy, the dragon seed pulsing with a rhythmic, hot thrum against the priest's cold logic. He could feel the weight of the words. They weren't just insults, they were mental traps designed to make his will falter. The Grand Priest was the architect of reality, and he was trying to build a cage out of Goku's own conscience. But the dragon within Goku didn't care about functions or equations. It only cared about the heartbeat. "You're wrong," Goku rasped, his eyes glowing with a deeper, more dangerous bronze. "Zeno isn't a pencil. He's not a storm. He's Zeno. And if the only way your peace works is by turning him into a ghost, then your peace is a lie." The Grand Priest sighed, a sound like a cold wind through a graveyard. "Then you are beyond reason. You chose the instinct of the beast over the wisdom of the law. Very well. Let us see how your will holds up against the very definitions of the space you occupy." With a sudden sharp motion, the priest snapped his fingers. The throne room didn't just change, it inverted. The white marble floor became a ceiling of liquid glass, and the infinite rafters of the palace dissolved into a sea of burning, golden text. Goku felt his gravity shift, not once, but 100 times a second. Up became down, left became a memory, and his very sense of balance was torn from his mind. The disorientation was not merely physical, it was semantic. Goku felt his very identity being shredded by the Grand Priest's redefinitions. In one moment, the air he breathed was turned into the concept of hate, making every lungful feel like swallowing jagged glass. In the next, the distance between his fist and the priest's face was redefined as infinite, so that no matter how fast he moved, he remained frozen in a state of eternal approach. The Grand Priest stood in the center of the swirling chaos, untouched and unmoving, a fixed point in a world he was actively deconstructing. "You see, Son Goku? You are fighting with your muscles, but I am fighting with the alphabet. I am the one who decides what a punch means. I am the one who decides that pain is the only thing you are allowed to feel." Goku roared, the sound swallowed by a sudden vacuum of silence the priest had placed around his throat. He swung a heavy, armored leg, but the priest simply adjusted a single line of light in the air, and the force of Goku's own strike was redirected back into his own ribs. The dragon-scale armor groaned, sparks of bronze light flying as it absorbed a blow that should have shattered a planet. "You are a creature of cause and effect," the priest continued, his voice now sounding like a choir of 1,000 bells. "I am the cause. You are merely the effect. To rebel against me is to rebel against the fact that 1 + 1 = 2. The priest raised his hand, and the golden text from the walls began to swarm around Goku like a hive of incandescent hornets. Each character was a law, a restriction, a divine no. Thou shalt not move. Thou shalt not breathe. Thou shalt not hope. They latched onto the plates of his armor, turning from light into heavy leaden shackles that dragged Goku toward the shifting liquid floor. Goku's vision blurred. The dragon seed in his chest was no longer just a warmth, it was a frantic, burning coal. It was being suffocated by the sheer weight of the definitions being forced upon it. He could see Zeno, still trapped, still frozen, just a few feet away, yet the Grand Priest had defined that space as unreachable. To the system of heaven, the path to the king was a mathematical impossibility for a mortal. "Look at your hands, Saiyan," the priest mocked, his eyes glowing with a terrifying clinical light. "They are becoming the very marble you tread upon. The law does not hate you, it simply has no room for you. You are a rounding error that I am finally correcting." Goku looked down. The bronze scales on his forearms were indeed beginning to turn a dull, lifeless gray. The Grand Priest's mockery wasn't just verbal. It was a physical erosion of his will. For the first time since the void, Goku felt the icy touch of genuine doubt. How do you fight the person who writes the rules of the fight? How do you strike a man who can turn your intent into a question? But then from the deepest part of his spirit, deeper than the Saiyan pride, deeper than the years of training, the dragon voice whispered again. It didn't offer a technique. It didn't offer a power level. It offered a truth. A law is only a cage for those who believe in the bars. The dragon seed didn't flare this time. It went still. A cold, absolute stillness that matched the silence of the void. Goku's breathing slowed. He stopped fighting the shifting gravity. He stopped trying to bridge the infinite distance. He simply closed his eyes and listened to the heartbeat of the dragon seed, the heartbeat that had existed before the first law was ever whispered into the dark. The Grand Priest watched as the gray, lifeless marble reached Goku's throat. He expected a plea. He expected the desperate, flailing energy of a cornered animal. Instead, he found a silence that rivaled his own, a stillness so profound it felt as though Son Goku had simply ceased to be a participant in reality. The golden letters, the divine shackles of "Thou shalt not," began to tremble. They were latched onto Goku's skin, vibrating with the intent to crush him, but they were no longer finding purchase. It was as if the definition of Goku was changing from solid matter to something elemental, something that could not be grasped by grammar or geometry. "You speak of your laws as if they are the bones of the world," Goku said. His voice was no longer his own. It carried the resonance of 1,000 ancient canyons, a deep timbered growl that made the liquid glass ceiling of the palace ripple. "But a dragon doesn't care about the name of the wind. It just flies." Goku opened his eyes. The iris was gone, replaced by a swirling nebula of molten bronze and abyssal black. The dragon seed in his chest didn't just pulse. It exhaled, a wave of primal ki, the original unrefined breath of the cosmos, surged outward. It didn't strike the golden text, it ignored it. The laws of the Grand Priest, the definitions of distance and pain, simply slid off Goku's body like rain off a wing. The gray marble corruption didn't just break, it evaporated, reclaimed by the heat of a will that refused to be categorized. Goku took a step. The Grand Priest's brow furrowed. He flicked his wrist, instantly redefining the 3 feet of floor in front of Goku as the heart of a star. The marble should have turned into a localized supernova, vaporizing anything in its path. But as Goku's foot landed, the marble remained cool, white, and silent. Goku wasn't countering the priest's magic. He was simply existing in a state where that magic was irrelevant. "Impossible," the priest whispered, the word escaping his lips before he could catch it. "You are within the palace. You are under my jurisdiction. I have defined the gravity, the light, the very air." "Then your definitions are wrong," Goku interrupted. He was moving now, his pace slow and deliberate. Each step he took sent a shockwave of bronze light through the floor, cracking the Grand Priest's perfect geometry. The dragon-scale armor on his shoulders began to glow with a dull, internal heat, looking less like a suit of mail and more like the skin of a living god. Goku reached the edge of the infinite distance the priest had placed around the throne. To the rest of the universe, that space was a mathematical trap that would take an eternity to cross. Goku didn't run. He didn't use Ultra Instinct. He simply reached out a hand and pushed. The air groaned. The golden text swarming the room began to scream, the characters flickering and dying like short-circuited lights. Goku's hand passed through the infinite barrier as if it were nothing more than a cobweb in an old house. He stood now only inches from the Grand Priest, the heat of the dragon seed radiating off him in visible distortions. The priest's mockery was gone, replaced by a sharp, clinical focus that bordered on genuine fear. For the first time in an eon, the architect of the universe realized he was no longer the one holding the pen. "The law is for those who are afraid of the dark," Goku growled, his face inches from the priest's. "But the dragon lives in the dark." Goku's fist tightened, and the bronze scales on his knuckles elongated into jagged, lethal points. The brand of the target on his hand flared with such intensity it turned the white walls of the palace a deep, bruised crimson. He wasn't just a threat to a guard anymore, he was a threat to the designer. The Grand Priest's composure didn't just crack, it dissolved into a mask of cold, calculating fury. As Goku's armored hand shattered the infinite distance, the very air between them began to bleed violet sparks. The priest realized that Son Goku was no longer playing by the rules of the divine court. He had brought a primal, chaotic law into a house built on absolute order. "You believe you have transcended the law?" the Grand Priest whispered, his voice now a chorus of 1,000 jagged shards. "You have merely found a bigger cage. If you will not be a citizen of heaven, you shall be the fuel for its furnace." With a sudden, violent expansion of his arms, the priest invoked the lattice of erasure at a scale never before seen. The throne room vanished. In its place appeared a golden lattice, a multi-dimensional web of light that stretched into the infinite. This was the true form of the angelic system, a cage made of pure mathematical certainty. Every intersection of the lattice was a lock, every beam was a commandment. Goku felt the lattice snap shut around him. It didn't just bind his arms, it bound his potential. The dragon-scale armor groaned, the bronze plates turning white-hot as the lattice tried to recalculate Goku's mass into zero. The pressure was so immense that Goku's very vision began to fragment into geometric shapes. He saw the world not as a place of friends and earth, but as a series of cold, unfeeling equations. "This is the Supreme Angel's true authority," the priest declared, his form now a towering pillar of translucent light. "A world where every breath is measured, every thought is sanctioned. You are a stain on this lattice, Goku, and a stain must be scrubbed." The golden beams of the lattice began to vibrate, the frequency designed to shatter the dragon seed by finding the flaw in its ancient rhythm. Goku's knees hit the invisible floor. He could feel his very heart beginning to beat in the rhythm of the lattice, a cold, mechanical tick-tock that threatened to overwrite the thrum of the dragon. But as his forehead touched the cold, golden light, Goku didn't think of power levels. He didn't think of the Grand Priest. He thought of the way Zeno's small, round face looked when they shared a simple piece of candy. He thought of the laughter that the angels had deemed disorderly. You missed something," Goku gasped, his voice vibrating with the strain of the erasure. "And what could the law possibly overlook?" the priest mocked. "You forgot," Goku growled, his eyes snapping open with a fire that was no longer bronze but a deep, abyssal gold. "That a dragon doesn't just live in the world, a dragon eats the world." The dragon seed in Goku's chest didn't just pulse. It opened. It became a vacuum, a spiritual singularity that began to pull the golden beams of the lattice into Goku's own body. He wasn't resisting the law anymore, he was consuming it. The definitions of the Grand Priest were being pulled into the dragon's furnace and forged into something new. The bronze scales on Goku's arms began to change, turning into a dark, iridescent obsidian that reflected no light. This was the birth of the true dragon god power, a state where the user becomes the source of their own reality. As Goku stood up, the lattice of erasure didn't just break, it was inhaled. The Grand Priest fell back, his feet finally touching the floor in a sign of genuine instability. The scratch on his palm began to bleed a pale silver fluid. "You are eating the law?" the priest whispered, his voice trembling with a sensation he hadn't felt in an eternity, horror. Goku didn't answer. He simply looked at the chains still binding Zeno. With a single casual motion he reached out and gripped the air. The space around the chains buckled and tore. "The trial is over," Goku said, his voice now a singular, absolute command. "And you're the one who failed." The silence that followed Goku's consumption of the divine lattice was more violent than any explosion. It was the sound of a vacuum being filled by something that should not exist. As the golden beams of angelic law were pulled into the furnace of the dragon seed, the palace of Zeno seemed to groan, a deep structural moan that resonated through the dimensions. The pristine white walls flickered, momentarily revealing the raw, dark static of the uncreated void behind them. Goku stood at the center of the unraveling reality. The bronze scales that had once shielded him were now gone, replaced by an armor of shifting obsidian. This was not merely a physical change. The scales seemed to be made of a substance that trapped light, swirling with a faint, iridescent oil-slick sheen that whispered of ancient, forgotten galaxies. Every time he moved, the air didn't just ripple, it tore. He was no longer a guest in the house of the angels. He was a hole in their tapestry. The Grand Priest staggered back, his silver blood dripping onto the marble floor. To an angel, blood was an impossibility, a sign that the fundamental rules of their existence had been compromised. He looked at Goku, at the eyes that held no mortality, only the cold, burning focus of a true dragon god, and he felt a sensation that was entirely foreign to his kind, the weight of a shadow. "You have committed the ultimate theft," the priest whispered, his voice trembling with a clinical, sharp terror. "You have not just broken the law. You have stolen the authority to define it. Do you have any idea what you have done, Son Goku? By consuming the lattice, you have anchored the multiverse to your own heartbeat. If your heart stops, if your will flinches for even a second, everything that is, was, and will be shall simply cease to be." Goku didn't flinch. He looked down at his hand, watching as the black scales pulsed with a rhythmic bronze light. He could feel the veins of reality now, not as abstract concepts, but as living arteries of power flowing through the palace, into the throne, and into Zeno. "Then I won't let it stop," Goku said, his voice carrying the resonance of a world being born. "The difference between your law and mine is simple. Yours needs a cage to keep things in place. Mine just needs a reason to protect them." The Grand Priest's face twisted, his serene mask finally dissolving into a snarl of desperate geometric rage. "Then let us see how much protection your heart can offer when the palace itself decides you are no longer real." The priest raised both hands toward the shifting ceiling. The lattice of erasure did not return as a cage of light. It returned as a total environmental collapse. The palace began to forget the concept of space. The distance between Goku and the Grand Priest began to fold and warp, creating a localized event horizon where the laws of physics were being shredded. The floor beneath Goku's feet didn't just break. It lost its permission to exist, turning into a swirling vortex of white gold static that fought to dissolve his obsidian armor back into data. The Grand Priest was no longer acting as a teacher or even a judge. He was acting as a cosmic deletion key. As he channeled the full weight of the supreme angelic authority, the throne room began to simplify. The colors bled out of the air. The ornate carvings on the pillars smoothed over into featureless cylinders, and the depth of the room collapsed into a two-dimensional plane. It was a sensory genocide, a forced return to the blank canvas of the void. Goku felt the pressure against his obsidian scales intensify. It wasn't a physical weight, but a mental erosion. The palace was telling his brain that breathing was no longer a valid action. It was telling his heart that beating was a violation of the current protocol. He watched as his own reflection in the obsidian of his forearm began to blur, the edges of his existence fraying into white gold sparks. "Existence is a privilege granted by the throne," the Grand Priest roared, his voice now a cacophony of shattering glass. "And I am the one who holds the deed. You are evicted, Son Goku. You are redacted from the Book of Life." But Goku didn't fight the erasure with power. He fought it with memory. He closed his eyes, ignoring the collapsing geometry of the room, and reached deep into the dragon seed. He didn't look for Ki. He looked for the feeling of the sun on his face at Mount Paozu. He looked for the weight of a fishing pole in his hands. He looked for the sound of Chi-Chi's voice, calling him for dinner. These were things the Grand Priest could not define because they were built on the messy, chaotic imperfections of life. The dragon seed flared, and the obsidian armor began to pulse with a deep, earthy crimson. Suddenly, the two-dimensional world around Goku shattered. Reality didn't just return, it surged back with a vengeance. The colors that returned were more vivid than before. The red of the alarm sigils became as deep as blood, the bronze of the dragon power as bright as a dying sun. Goku stepped forward, and where his foot landed, the white gold static of the floor was forced to remember it was marble. He was writing the world back into existence with every stride. "Your privilege doesn't mean anything to me," Goku growled, his voice a landslide of gravel and fire. "Because I don't need your permission to be alive." The Grand Priest's hands trembled. He tried to invoke a new commandment, a new string of logic to bind the Saiyan, but the words died in his throat. He realized that Goku wasn't just resisting the lattice of erasure, he was replacing it. The Dragon Law was blooming out of Goku like a forest growing through the cracks of a sidewalk, indifferent to the concrete that tried to hold it back. Goku reached the throne. He stood before the silent, weeping Zeno and the terrified Grand Priest. The obsidian armor on his chest opened slightly, revealing the Dragon Seed, now a blinding sun of primal authority. "Step away from him," Goku commanded. The words were not a request. They were a physical force. The Grand Priest was flung backward, his body slamming into the far wall of the palace, which groaned and cracked under the impact of a command it could not disobey. Goku turned to the chains. He didn't grab them this time. He simply looked at them. Goku stood before the throne, his presence an absolute anchor in a room that was still trying to dissolve. He didn't reach out with his hands. He reached out with his intent. The obsidian armor on his shoulders flared, and for a moment a spectral image of a gargantuan ancient dragon coiled behind him, its eyes two burning suns of judgment. The chains of authority, those shimmering, cruel filaments of angel law, began to hiss. They were designed to hold the weight of a king, to bind the strongest soul in the multiverse, but they were not designed for a heart that had rewritten the definition of impossible. "Zeno," Goku said softly, his voice cutting through the high-pitched scream of the failing palace defenses. "Close your eyes, it's gonna get loud." Goku didn't pull the chains, he spoke to them in the language of the Dragon Seed. He exhaled a single concentrated burst of dragon breath. Not a flame, but a wave of pure, unrefined permission. It was a declaration that the chains were no longer needed, that the law they represented was obsolete. The effect was catastrophic for the celestial system. The filaments of light turned from gold to a brittle, sickly gray. Then they began to crack. Each fracture released a peal of thunder that echoed across the 12 universes. In the distance, on the world of the Kaioshin, the stars flickered. In the realm of the gods of destruction, Beerus stood up from his nap, a cold sweat breaking across his brow as he felt the very concept of his authority tremble. The Grand Priest, pinned against the wall by the sheer weight of Goku's presence, watched in a state of catatonic shock. "You are unmaking the foundation," he whispered, silver blood trailing from his mouth. "Without those chains, there is no order. There is only him." "Good," Goku replied. With a sound like the shattering of 1,000,000,000,000 glass bells, the chains snapped. The backlash of energy was so immense it stripped the marble from the walls and the color from the air. Zeno's body slumped forward, free from the invisible pulleys that had held him upright for eons. Goku caught the small king in his arms, the obsidian armor softening into a protective, warm cocoon as he pulled his friend close. For a long, terrifying minute, the palace went dark. The light of the angels had been extinguished. Then, in the center of the ruin, Zeno's small hands reached up and gripped Goku's gi. A tiny, muffled sob broke the silence, a sound more powerful than any divine decree. It was the sound of a child who had finally been found. "Goku," Zeno whispered, his voice shaky and small. You stayed." "Always, little guy," Goku said, his own voice thick with emotion. But the victory was short-lived. The Grand Priest didn't fall. He began to laugh, a sharp, hysterical sound that rang with the hollowness of a broken machine. He stood up, his body flickering, as if his very existence was a faulty projection. "You think this is the end?" The priest spat, his eyes burning with a localized violet supernova. "You have freed the puppet, but you have triggered the auto-erasure of the throne. If the king is not bound, the king is a threat, and the system has one final rule for threats." The brand of the target on Goku's hand suddenly burned with a black, oily fire. The Grand Priest's laughter was a jagged, mechanical sound that tore through the remaining silence like a serrated blade. As he stood, his form didn't just flicker, it expanded, his translucent skin becoming a map of every star system currently under his protection. But the stars on his skin were blinking out, one by one. The death of the chains was the death of his control, and a cornered angel was a thing of terrifying cold calculation. "The system does not sleep, Son Goku," the priest hissed, his voice now a chorus of 1,000,000,000 dying signals. "The throne is not just a chair, it is a seal. By removing the king from his shackles, you have armed the grand executioner protocol." High above, the concentric circles of the Eye of the Law didn't just watch anymore. They began to rotate in opposite directions, creating a friction in the fabric of reality that produced a sound like the grinding of worlds. The black, oily fire from the brand on Goku's hand began to spread, not as heat, but as a weight. It felt as if the gravity of an entire galaxy was being condensed into the palm of his hand, trying to pull him and the Zeno he held down into the very floor of the palace. "The king must remain pure," the priest quoted, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. "And anything that touches him becomes the stain. You are the stain, Goku, and the universe is about to wash its hands of you." The violet light in the priest's eyes exploded. He didn't move his body, but he moved the definition of the space Goku occupied. Suddenly, the warmth of the dragon seed felt distant, as if it were being muffled by a thick, wet blanket of static. Goku felt his muscles lock. The obsidian armor on his shoulders began to flake away, turning into a fine, black dust that was immediately sucked into the Eye of the Law above. "Goku, I'm scared," Zeno whispered, his small hands tightening on Goku's chest. "Don't look up, Zeno," Goku growled, his jaw set so tight his teeth threatened to crack. He could feel his very soul being pulled in two directions, the dragon seed trying to anchor him to his own life, and the grand executioner protocol trying to drag him into a state of non-existence. The Grand Priest raised his hand, pointing a single blood-stained finger at Goku's heart. "Final decree, redact the anomaly, erase the memory, return the void to its silence." The Eye of the Law fired. It wasn't a beam of light, but a column of absolute nothing. It moved, and with the speed of a thought, a white-hot erasure that promised to turn Goku and Zeno into a footnote in a history that would never be written. But Goku didn't dodge. He didn't close his eyes. He leaned forward, shielding Zeno with his entire body, and let out a roar that bypassed his vocal cords and came directly from the ancient primordial core of the dragon god. The brand on his hand didn't just burn, it shattered. The obsidian scales on his back surged, growing into a massive, jagged wingspan of dark, divine energy that caught the white column of erasure. The impact sent a shock wave through the palace that finally leveled the remaining pillars. The nothing met the everything of the dragon's will, and for a heartbeat, the two powers stood at a standstill. "I told you," Goku gasped, his skin beginning to glow with a terrifying golden-black radiance. "I don't need your permission to be a friend." With a violent heave of his spirit, Goku redirected the erasure. He didn't send it back at the priest, he sent it into the floor, using the system's own power to blast a hole through the foundations of the palace. The white void beneath them opened up, a path back to the lower universes. "We're leaving," Goku commanded. He didn't wait for the priest to respond. He leapt into the abyss, clutching Zeno to his chest, as the palace of Zeno began to fold in on itself, a house of cards collapsing after its king had been stolen. The fall was not a descent through air, but a violent transit through the layers of the cosmic mind. Colors that shouldn't exist, hues of bruised ultraviolet and screaming crimson, smeared past Goku's vision as he plummeted away from the palace. In his arms, Zeno was a small, trembling weight, a sun that had forgotten how to shine. Behind them, the palace of Zeno didn't just shrink, it imploded, the Grand Executioner Protocol turning the seed of creation into a localized black hole of pure white-hot law. Goku's obsidian armor was being stripped away by the friction of the dimensions, flaking off in glowing embers that looked like dying stars. But the dragon seed in his chest remained steady, its heartbeat a deep, resonant drum that provided the only rhythm in the chaotic silence of the fall. He wasn't just falling, he was being hunted. The brand on the back of his hand, the mark of Target 01, was no longer just a sigil. It was a weeping wound of black light, broadcasting his coordinates to every corner of the 12 universes. "They're coming, Goku," Zeno whispered, his voice sounding thin and metallic. "The angels, they're all waking up. I can hear them thinking." Goku gritted his teeth, his boots finally striking a solid surface with the force of a falling comet. He had landed on a rogue moon in the neutral space between Universe 7 and Universe 6. The impact crater was miles wide, the gray dust settling slowly in the low gravity. He stood up, his breathing coming in jagged crystalline bursts. His GI was shredded, his skin was mapped with glowing blue ley lines of exhaustion, and the obsidian scales were now only a thin, protective layer over his heart. He looked up at the sky. It wasn't the sky he knew. Across the velvet blackness of space, golden ripples were spreading, waves of authority moving outward from the site of the palace's ruin. It was a universal dragnet. The Grand Priest had not just declared Goku a criminal. He had declared Goku's very existence to be a violation of the natural order. "Let them come," Goku growled, his voice vibrating with a new, somber gravity. He set Zeno down on the dusty ground, standing over him like a living shield. Suddenly, the space in front of them fractured. It didn't ripple or tear. It opened like a surgical incision. 3 figures stepped through, not the silver-masked guards from the palace, but high-tier angels, their halos spinning with a lethal, humming precision. They didn't carry lances, they carried scrolls of absolute fate. "Son Goku," the central angel spoke, his voice a flat, emotionless drone that carried the weight of a death sentence. "By the authority of the vacant throne, you are hereby stripped of your name, your history, and your right to occupy matter. You have stolen the king. You have broken the scale. The multiverse can no longer afford the space you take up." Goku didn't take a fighting stance. He didn't power up. He simply looked at the brand on his hand, then at the angels who had once been the shepherds of his world. The dragon seed within him shifted, its power cooling into something dense, heavy, and absolute. "You're still talking about authority and scales," Goku said, his eyes glowing with a dark, abyssal bronze. "But you're standing in front of your king, and not one of you has asked him if he's okay." The angels didn't blink. To them, Zeno was no longer a person to be cared for. He was a component that had been compromised. They unrolled their scrolls, and the very stars above the moon began to realign into a pattern of execution. The 3 angels did not respond to Goku's words. To them, his sentiment was merely the sentimental static of a dying species. They began to chant, a sound that bypassed the air and resonated directly within the structure of Goku's cells. As they spoke, the scrolls of absolute fate ignited, the burning parchment releasing ash that didn't fall but drifted upward to form a shimmering golden dome over the moon. Inside this dome, the angels were rewriting the rules of the local reality. They defined the moon's gravity as crushing, and suddenly Goku felt as if a mountain had been placed upon his shoulders. They defined the light as evasive, and the world plunged into a sensory darkness where he could no longer see his own hand. "The king is a component," the central angel reiterated, his voice a cold vibration in the dark. "A component cannot have feelings, it can only have functions. You have introduced a virus into the source. We are the purge." Goku's knees hit the gray dust. The brand on his hand was screaming now, a high-pitched psychic wail that synchronized with the angel's chant. He could feel the dragon seed struggling to breathe under the weight of the absolute fate. It was one thing to fight a fist, it was another to fight the very idea that you were allowed to exist. But then he felt a small warm hand touch his arm. Zeno had crawled toward him in the dark. The king of all, once the most feared presence in the cosmos, was trembling, his fingers clutching Goku's tattered sleeve. "Goku, don't go into the quiet," Zeno whispered. "The quiet is where they keep the chains." That small, fragile spark of self from Zeno acted like a match dropped into a pool of gasoline. The dragon seed didn't just flare, it detonated. The obsidian scales on Goku's body didn't return. Instead, his very skin began to take on a metallic, bronze-black luster. He forced himself upward, his spine cracking as he pushed against the crushing gravity of the angel's law. "You call him a component," Goku rasped, his eyes burning through the artificial darkness like twin supernovae. "But I call him my friend, and a dragon doesn't let anyone touch his horde." He lunged. He didn't move with the grace of an angel. He moved with the brutal, unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. He reached the first angel before the scroll could finish its next verse. His fist, coated in the raw, unrefined power of the true dragon god, didn't strike the angel's body. It struck the scroll of fate. The parchment didn't burn, it shattered like frozen glass. The angel let out a sound of genuine, high-pitched shock, a harmonic dissonance that cracked the golden dome above them. "The law is a lie!" Goku roared, his voice shaking the moon to its core. "The only real thing in this whole universe is the promise I made to keep him safe." He swung a backhand that caught the second angel, the force of the blow carrying the weight of the dragon void itself. The angel was sent skipping across the vacuum of space, his halo snapping into two useless arcs of fading light. Goku stood in the center of the crater, his aura a swirling, violent storm of black and bronze, his very presence defying the absolute fate the heavens tried to impose on him. The remaining angel, the one who had spoken of functions and purges, froze. His translucent face, normally as still as a frozen lake, now rippled with a chaotic, shimmering fear. He looked at the shards of the scroll of absolute fate, the literal script of the future, lying in the gray dust like discarded trash. By breaking the scroll, Goku hadn't just won a fight, he had committed a metaphysical murder. He had killed the predetermined. You have orphaned the timeline," the angel whispered, his voice cracking into 1,000 discordant notes. "Without the script, the stars have no map. You have traded the safety of the path for the madness of the wild." "Good," Goku said. His voice was no longer a shout. It was a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. The path was a cage anyway. A cage. Goku stepped forward. He didn't use a technique, but the air in front of him simply folded out of his way, refusing to offer resistance to a true dragon god. He grabbed the angel's remaining scroll and crushed it in his palm. The explosion of golden ink and divine light didn't blind him. It absorbed into his skin, turning the obsidian luster of his body into a deep, matty black that felt as solid as the heart of a dead star. The angel began to dissolve. Without his law, he had no definition. Without his scroll, he had no reason to occupy space. He faded into a cloud of pale, silver motes, leaving Goku and Zeno alone on the silent, broken moon. Goku's aura slowly receded, leaving him standing in the crater, his chest heaving. The brand on his hand didn't disappear, but it changed. The oily black fire was gone, replaced by a permanent, scale-shaped scar that pulsed with a soft bronze light. He was no longer a target to be hunted. He was an outlaw to be feared. He had stepped outside the circle of the heavens, and for the first time in his life, There was no master above him, no God to answer to, and no law to follow but his own. He turned back to Zeno. The small king was standing now, his eyes no longer dull, but wide with a terrifying new awareness. He looked at Goku, then up at the stars, and then back at Goku. "The chains are gone," Zeno said, his voice finally steady, "but I feel heavy." "That's just life, Zeno," Goku said, offering a tired, calloused hand to the king of all. "It's heavy because you're the one carrying it now. No more puppets, no more scripts." Zeno took his hand. As they stood together on the edge of the crater, looking out at a multiverse that was now a chaotic, unmapped frontier, the silence of the moon felt different. It wasn't the sterile quiet of the palace, it was the silence before a storm. High above, the golden ripples of the Grand Priest's authority continued to search the dark, but they passed over the moon without seeing it. Goku had hidden them in the only place the angels couldn't look, the truth of a moment that wasn't planned. Goku looked toward the distant, glowing speck that was Earth. He knew the war wasn't over. He knew the Grand Priest would rewrite the very stars to find them. He knew that by becoming the true dragon god, he had sacrificed the peace of his old life for a path of eternal vigilance. But as Zeno squeezed his hand, Goku felt a sense of rightness that no divine decree could ever match. The dragon had broken the lattice, the outlaw had stolen the king, and somewhere in the deep, ancient veins of the universe, a heartbeat that had been silenced for eons began to thrum with the rhythm of a new, wild age. The stars burned quietly, as if remembering his will.